Hi y'all. So this is our second video for critical criminology. And today I'm going to be talking about your guys' discussion posts on the Moral Panic articles. And then I'll give a brief introduction to our next set of articles which deal with drugs. So a few things. You guys did a great job. It was a good discussion. I'm just going to bring out some of the nuances of the moral panic literature that I think got passed over a little. In a lot of ways, we could talk about the moral panic literature as a question of, one, how is it that we perceive the crime that's going on around us, right? How much of the way in which we think about crime has to do with perception rather than reality? And then the other part of the question is in that, right? In this sort of creating this sort of like false world where we think crime's happening where it's not, and think that crime isn't happening where it is, who gets thrown under the bus? Who gets hurt by that? And it's generally marginalized groups that do. So in the moral panic literature, understanding how our perceptions work is really the key to understanding the relationship between what we perceive as normal and deviant. And that's because things only become issues when they're perceived as issues. So I had given, in my little introduction, I had said that there's a big literature on moral panic and drugs. And how you see that playing out is this idea of like, we fight this massive war on drugs. Who gets thrown under the bus within the war on drugs? It's usually people from poor, impoverished neighborhoods. And how is it that we came to see this as a problem, right? We could tie this in pretty closely to this week's articles as well. How did we come to perceive this to be a problem? And often it's something irrational. And it's a bunch of people becoming somewhat hysterical around an issue. We see that in the same thing with like, you have that example, I think it was in Denver, some of you guys commented on it, of, or in Colorado someplace, where all of a sudden, like, these sodomy laws that have been on the books forever, right? Nobody really done anything about them. They weren't perceived as a problem, they just sort of sat there on paper. All of a sudden, like, they catch a couple people, with underage men, and then all of a sudden these sodomy laws, like, they're just going after everybody. Keep in mind at this time, too, like, homosexuality is illegal, right? So quite literally, like, people are committing a crime, even if they're having consensual sex with other adult males. In fact, any form of non-intercourse sex is illegal under a lot of the sodomy laws at the time, in the 50s and 60s. Anyways, so, like, wasn't perceived as an issue to, like, basically them trying to round up everybody, right? How is it that happens? Where does that come from? So for the moral panic literature, it's very interested in how there's just sort of, like, underlying cultural values, right? These ways of feeling about the world. If you think about the example of the cult out in Brazil and them sort of attacking them in mass, same idea. There's this underlying cultural value about the modernization of Brazil. And then this religious group is seen as sort of flying in the face of that. It brings up the ire of people, particularly people with power, people who are connected with the annals of policing, right? People who are capable of using police power, which would be a lot of us, right? Like, as myself, a middle class, mostly white person, sorry about that. Middle class, mostly white person, I call the police will show up and they'll help me with something. So I command police power. So the perceptions of people are really important for understanding how basically how policing occurs, how funding gets created, how laws are made, and that all of these things have more to do with our cultural expressions of value and normativity and desire for conformity. Conformity from groups often that are unlike us, than it does anything else. So that's a major theme within the moral panic literature. And we can think about all kinds of stuff that would fit in that. So it's like thinking, like I said, about drugs, whether we're talking about, you know, impoverished rural areas or impoverished urban areas, and how drug policy happens, the perception of drugs being dangerous or not dangerous. We can also think about like the way that the police often treat homeless, or even city governments treat homeless people. There's a lot of abuse of homeless people, sometimes outside of the law even. You know, homeless people are often harassed by the government. Do you guys know the organization Uplift? Maybe some of you do. Our school does a lot with Uplift. And I was having a conversation with the people up in or down in Kansas City, they were talking about the Kansas City government wanting to shut them down, and taking action against this charity that tries to help homeless people. And essentially, the city's government stance is that, like, if you stop feeding and clothing them, they either die or leave, and that would be beneficial. So here you see sort of like, you know, to some degree, like, and why is it that the government feels that way? It's because a lot of people have these attitudes towards homeless people, this fear of them. Even though usually homeless people are pretty innocuous, they don't actually commit a lot of crimes, they're not super dangerous. You know, they have a tendency to commit some drug crimes, or, you know, public indecency in terms of, you know, using the restroom, you know, or things like that, public intoxication. But by and large, they're not the most dangerous populations, but we perceive them as such. We often perceive them as being incredibly dangerous. People are very afraid of them, and why is that? It's because culturally we stigmatize poverty. So if the government takes action against them, or if people feel like, we will often talk about having a homeless problem. Any city that has homeless people perceives it as having a homeless problem. And that perception is a form of moral panic. So that gives you kind of like all the pieces in play: marginalized groups, attitudes, hysteria, and as a result, right, we police people who are often in vulnerable positions, but we also police them when there's no specific need to police them. So the way in which our police end up being targeted, and that's not the fault of the police, that's largely the fault of our culture, and the inequalities that are latent sort of symbols, ideologies within our culture, that create expectations that police should be overly policing poor neighbors, should be doing these things. And so moral panic and how people get treated and how laws get made are all sort of intertwined. Okay, so for this week we have two articles, one of which is Toimi. This article is specifically on the history of drugs in Colombia. Basically on the failures of the war on drugs, something you guys are probably familiar with. And the one that I'm really excited about is the Linneman article. This is your face on meth. And it's very interesting things in there. Linneman is a visual criminologist who does really interesting interpretive work. I've assigned some other articles of his in the past, and this one's pretty interesting as well. It's going to look at how the way in which we talk about drug users, the way in which we depict them visually, in particular, is tied up in basically forms of racism, how it's tied up in dehumanization, and what are the things that dance behind that. So I'll look forward on hearing your guys' thoughtful comments on both articles, and then I will talk about the discussion board and introduce our next set of articles next Monday. I also wanted to say that I hear more from people, particularly people outside of Kansas, that I know, that a lot of people are dealing with in a very direct manner. The pandemic right now, that they know people who have it, that family members may have it. Moving forward, if this touches you directly, please let me know. I want you to concentrate your energies where you need to. Other than that, stay safe and have a great week.